The backlash was so immediate, so public, and so coordinated that it looked less like a disagreement and more like a revolt. In the middle of the 2026 World Cup, UEFA President Alexander Čeferin reportedly dismissed a large portion of the tournament's expanded schedule as completely uninteresting. Not a coach, not a pundit, not an angry fan on social media, the most powerful figure in European football, and within days, the response came. Not from one nation, not from two, but from a coalition of 13 countries, many from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, united in a public statement that effectively accused Europe's football establishment of disrespecting the rest of the world. Suddenly, what looked like a debate about tournament formats became something much bigger, because this was never really about matches, it was about power, and once you start looking at it that way, the entire World Cup starts to look different. The trigger seems simple enough. For decades, the World Cup featured 32 teams, then FIFA expanded it to 48. The argument was straightforward: more countries, more opportunities, more regions represented, more people feeling connected to the biggest sporting event on earth. For FIFA, it was presented as football becoming truly global. For critics, especially in Europe, it was something else. They saw a tournament becoming bloated, too many teams, too many games, too many mismatches, too many fixtures that nobody outside the participating countries would actually care about. And when Čeferin's comments surfaced, many people interpreted them as saying the quiet part out loud, that some World Cup participants simply did not belong on the same stage. But that's where the story starts becoming uncomfortable, because the reaction wasn't merely about offense, it was about history. For decades, European football has occupied a position of enormous influence. The strongest leagues, the biggest clubs, the largest television audiences, the highest revenues, the deepest talent pools. Nobody seriously disputes that Europe dominates elite football. The problem is what happens when dominance begins to look like ownership, because the countries responding to UEFA's remarks were essentially asking a dangerous question. Who gets to decide what the World Cup is supposed to be? Europe? Or the world? And suddenly every argument about match quality became tangled up with questions about representation, access, and legitimacy. Then came the defense. And to be fair, the European side isn't entirely irrational. That's what makes this controversy so difficult. Look at some of the score lines. Look at the talent gaps. Look at the rankings. Critics of expansion argue that adding more teams inevitably creates more one-sided matches. They point to games that appear decided before kickoff. They point to weaker squads facing football superpowers. They point to television audiences that may struggle to care about certain fixtures. And from a purely sporting perspective, there is logic there. If the objective is creating the highest concentration of elite competition possible, then limiting participation makes sense. The strongest teams face the strongest teams. Every match feels significant. Every group feels dangerous. Every result carries enormous weight. That's the argument. And on the surface, it's not difficult to understand. But then another question emerges. If that's the goal, why stop at 32 teams? Why not 24? Why not 16? Why not create an exclusive club where only the traditional powers are invited? And that's where the expansion supporters believe the entire logic begins to collapse. Because they argue the World Cup was never supposed to be a private tournament for football's aristocracy. It was supposed to be the world's tournament. Every continent, every culture, every football dream, no matter how small, no matter how unlikely, no matter how inconvenient it might be for television executives or tournament planners. And that sounds idealistic until you bring it down to the human level, because eventually this debate stops being about spreadsheets and rankings. It becomes about people. Take a nation like Curaçao. For football giants, qualification can feel almost routine. A difficult challenge, certainly, but still an expectation. For emerging football nations, reaching a World Cup is different. It's generational. It can represent decades of work, years of investment, thousands of players, hundreds of coaches, entire communities waiting for a moment they never thought would arrive. Now imagine finally reaching the biggest stage in football. Imagine hearing your national anthem at a World Cup. Imagine representing millions of people. Then imagine being told your presence makes the tournament less interesting. Suddenly the argument sounds very different, and that's exactly why this controversy exploded, because one side was discussing competitive quality, the other side was was discussing dignity, and those conversations rarely end well. But there was another layer making everything worse: money. Because while people were arguing about principles, tournament organizers were dealing with practical realities. The expanded World Cup is massive. More teams means more matches, more venues, more logistics, more travel, more staffing, more security, more everything. And filling giant stadiums for every single fixture is not as easy as it sounds, especially when certain matches involve countries with smaller traveling fan bases. Attendance gaps started becoming part of the conversation. Ticket pricing became part of the conversation. Questions about demand became part of the conversation. Critics immediately seized on those issues. They argued these were warning signs, proof that expansion was stretching the tournament beyond its natural limits, proof that quantity was overtaking quality, proof that UEFA's concerns should not be dismissed so easily. And for a moment, it seemed like the momentum was shifting. Except the more people discussed attendance figures and ticket sales, the more another contradiction appeared. The World Cup isn't just a sporting event anymore. It's a political symbol, and symbols operate differently than businesses, because even if certain matches attract smaller audiences, FIFA can still argue that global inclusion has value beyond immediate commercial returns. A debut appearance from a developing football nation may not generate the same ratings as Germany versus Brazil, but what is the value of inspiring an entire generation? What is the value of growing football in new regions? What is the value of creating future markets, future players, future fans? Those questions don't fit neatly into attendance spreadsheets, and suddenly the debate became even harder to resolve. Then came the part that should probably concern FIFA the most. Trust started breaking down, not trust between fans and officials, trust between football institutions themselves. Because this wasn't a random argument, this was UEFA and FIFA drifting further apart in public view, the two most influential power centers in world football appearing increasingly comfortable criticizing each other's vision, and history suggests that when governing bodies begin fighting openly, deeper tensions usually exist beneath the surface. Different priorities, different incentives, different definitions of success. One side emphasizing elite competition, the other emphasizing global expansion. One side protecting established standards, the other expanding access, and neither side showing much willingness to retreat. That is what transformed this from a controversy into a warning sign, because football has seen these fractures before. Whenever questions emerge about who controls the game's future, the disputes rarely stay confined to a single issue. Today it's tournament expansion, tomorrow it could be scheduling, revenue distribution, player workloads, club versus country conflicts, calendar disputes, broadcast rights, influence, authority, power. The argument keeps widening, and perhaps the most remarkable part is that neither side can easily claim complete victory. UEFA can point to legitimate concerns. The quality debate is real. The logistical challenges are real. The commercial questions are real. Dismissing those concerns entirely would be dishonest. At the same time, FIFA and the coalition of nations can point to something equally powerful. The World Cup has always been bigger than efficiency, bigger than optimization, bigger than creating the perfect television product. Its appeal comes from possibility, from unlikely stories, from countries arriving on the stage for the first time, from dreams that look unrealistic until they suddenly aren't. Both arguments contain truth, which is exactly why this conflict refuses to disappear, and that leaves football in a strange position, because the real battle isn't over a quote. It's not even over a tournament format. It's over competing visions of what football should become: a premium product featuring the strongest teams and the highest standards, or a truly global event where opportunity matters as much as excellence. Those visions sound compatible, until difficult choices have to be made, until stadiums need filling, until broadcast deals need signing, until qualification spots need allocating, until somebody gets excluded. Then the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. And that's why the reaction to Čeferin's comments was so explosive. Many people heard criticism of a format, others heard criticism of entire nations. Many people heard a practical concern, others heard a reminder that football's traditional power centers still believe they should decide who belongs. Whether that interpretation is fair or not almost becomes secondary, because perception drives politics, and politics drives institutions, and institutions drive football, which means this story is not ending anytime soon. The rest of the tournament may ultimately become the final judge. If the expanded format delivers unforgettable moments, FIFA's position strengthens. If empty seats, mismatches, and organizational headaches dominate the headlines, UEFA's warnings gain credibility. But either way, something important has already happened. A line has been crossed. The disagreement is no longer private. The struggle is no longer hidden, and for the first time on football's biggest stage, the question isn't simply who will win the World Cup, it's who gets to define what the World Cup actually is.